Tower Hill, London, the morning of April the 9th, 1747. And there isn't an inch of ground left to stand on. Wooden stands have gone up around the scaffold, hastily built, badly built, because half of London wants to watch this particular old man die. He's 80 years old by most accounts. He can barely walk up the steps without help. And when he looks out at the crowd from the scaffold, he doesn't see grief. He sees a circus. His name is Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, Chief of Clan Fraser. And in a few minutes, one of Britain's most notorious double dealers is going to become the last person in the country's history to lose his head in public. Then the stand nearest the scaffold gives way. It collapses under the weight of the crowd, and something like 20 spectators go down with it, crushed, several of them fatally. Lovat watches this happen, and according to the men standing closest to him, he starts laughing. That's not the strange part. The strange part is what he is. Legally, in the moment the axe comes down, Simon Fraser dies holding two separate identities that 18th century Britain treated as almost entirely different things. One of them is Lord Lovat, a title in the peerage of Scotland, granted by royal charter, tried this same year by his fellow peers in the House of Lords, and about to be formally, legally struck from existence by Act of Parliament. The other is Mac Shimid, Chief of Clan Fraser, head of a Highland kinship that no court in London had ever had the power to create, and, as it turns out, no court in London would ever quite manage to destroy. This is not a story about a beheading. This is not a story about a scandal, though Lovat gave Britain plenty of those over 80 years. This is a story about which one of those two titles Parliament could actually kill, and which one it couldn't touch no matter how hard it tried. To answer that, you have to go back roughly 600 years before Simon Fraser was born, to a word that has nothing to do with charters, courts, or crown seals at all. Clan, Gaelic. It means children, offspring. That's the word sitting underneath the whole system, and it tells you exactly how a Highland chief wanted his authority to be understood. Not as a grant, not as a contract, but as fatherhood. You didn't hold land from your chief the way an English tenant held it from a landlord. You belonged to him, and he to you, the way a family belongs to itself. And to be fair to the word, membership wasn't pure fiction. A chief's following really did include genuine bloodline. Cousins, second cousins, the tangled web of a Highland glen where half the valley shared a great-great-grandfather. But clans stretched further than that. Swear loyalty to a chief, take his name, fight under his banner for 2 or 3 generations, and the clan absorbed you. Kinship here was as much a political choice as a biological fact, which frankly made it a far more flexible tool than blood alone could ever be. The clan's claim to its land ran on a matching logic. Duthchas, the collective heritage of the people, not owned by the chief the way you'd own a farm, but held by him in trust, on the clan's behalf, for the clan's benefit. Fail that trust badly enough, in the older version of this system, and the clan could simply replace you, which is the other piece that doesn't fit the ancient hereditary monarch image most people carry around. Succession wasn't strictly father to eldest son. Chiefs were originally chosen through tanistry, the election, while the current chief still lived, of an heir apparent called the Taniest, literally, the second. Bloodline mattered. It wasn't everything. A weak or incompetent claimant could, in theory, lose out to a stronger cousin the assembled kinsman actually trusted to lead them. Put those 3 pieces together. Clan, Duthchas, Tanistry, and you get a genuinely different system from feudal Europe. No crown charter in this picture. No royal seal. Authority runs upward from the people, not downward from a king. Here's what most people get wrong about where that system stayed. They picture it sealed off. The Highlands as a kind of living museum, untouched by whatever was happening in Edinburgh or London. A pocket of pre-feudal Europe that just happened to survive into the 18th century by accident. It wasn't sealed off. It was never sealed off. From the 12th century onward, a second and completely different legal system started arriving in Scotland. Crown charters, feudal tenure, the whole Norman apparatus King David I imported wholesale from England and the continent. And it didn't stop politely at the Highland line. It went straight into the glens, straight into the clans themselves. And in more than a few cases, it didn't just influence the clans from the outside. It built some of them. Take Clan Fraser, Lovat's own clan, the one he died as chief of on Tower Hill, laughing at a collapsing grandstand. Say the name Fraser out loud, and most people picture the same thing. Ancient Highland blood, a claymore, a Gaelic pedigree stretching back into the mist. And that's exactly where the tidy version falls apart. The first Fraser on record in Scotland isn't a Highland warrior at all. He's a Norman French knight named Frizel, most likely out of the Frizelier lordship in Anjou, showing up in the record around 1160, witnessing a charter, granting a church to an abbey, doing exactly the kind of paperwork a newly arrived feudal landholder was expected to do. Not a chief elected by kinsmen, a knight granted land by a king. It took generations for the Frasers to migrate north, marry into Highland families, adopt the culture, the language, the loyalty, and eventually become, by every meaningful measure, one of the most fiercely Highland clans in the country. Lovat himself once said, there was nothing he placed in balance with his kindred. He meant it, but the kindred he was defending had a Norman knight standing at the root of the family tree, not a Gaelic tannist. Fraser isn't the exception. Look at Clan Chisholm, seated deep in Strathglass in the heart of the Highlands, and you find the same pattern almost exactly. The Chisholms start out as the de Chazeholm family, Anglo-Norman, holding land in the Scottish borders, appearing on a charter as early as 1249. In 1538, the Crown formally granted them the feudal barony of Comar in Inverness-shire. That's not folklore, that's a charter, with a date, creating a Highland barony out of a border family's feudal inheritance. So here's the myth, named plainly, the assumption that sounds Gaelic, wears tartan, therefore ancient and untouched by feudalism. And here's what the record actually shows instead. Some of the clans that look most authentically, most anciently Highland were, at their origin point, feudal grants to French-speaking knights. That doesn't make Fraser or Chisholm any less real as clans. Vilches and clan-based loyalty were genuinely built on top of these families, generation after generation, until nobody thought of them as newcomers at all. But it does mean the foundation most people imagine, pure, pre-feudal, untouched Celtic kinship, was never the whole story, even at the root. If that surprised you as much as it surprised me the first time I dug into Fraser's own genealogy, that's worth a like. It's how YouTube knows to put a video like this in front of more people who'd actually want to see it. There's a second Gaelic term worth setting down here, right next to Dúchas, because the two only make sense together. Oikreach. Individually held, individually inheritable estate. Land you own because a crown charter says you own it, not land your people trust you to protect. Fraser and Chisholm both entered the Highlands carrying Oidreach in their pocket before they'd ever accumulated a scrap of Dúchas-style clan loyalty. For most Highland families, it worked the other way around. Kinship first, charter later, if a charter came at all. Either direction, by the 16th and 17th centuries, most substantial chiefs were standing on both legs at once, which is exactly the problem the Crown eventually decided it needed to do something about. So, two clans, two Norman knights, two feudal charters, sitting quietly under two of the most authentically Highland names in Scotland. That's the pattern this channel exists to dig up. Take the version of history everyone already has in their head, and pull the actual paperwork out from underneath it. If digging through charters and court records to find where the popular version of a story quietly breaks down sounds like your kind of thing, that's what happens here every video. Subscribing means you don't miss the next one. Now, back to the problem the Crown had on its hands. By the 16th century, a chief who'd secured a Crown charter wasn't just a landlord on paper. He was, quite literally, a judge with the power to end your life. Scots law had a specific phrase for this, written straight into the charter itself. Cum fossa et furca, with pit and gallows. Furka for the gallows, where men were hanged. Fossa for the pit, where women convicted of capital crimes were drowned. Grant a barony with that clause attached, and you weren't handing someone a decorative title. You were handing them a court, a jurisdiction, and the legal right to execute people on their own land for the crimes named in their own charter. This is not a ceremonial phrase. This is not a folk memory dressed up as law. This is a documented legal power, and it did not stay theoretical. Dunvegan Castle's own records show men hanged on the laird's sentence as late as 1740, 6 years before Culloden, within living memory of people who'd go on to fight in the Jacobite Rising. So by this point, a chief like the one at Dunvegan is running two completely different operations out of the same castle. On one side, he's MacLeod, leader of the clan by Dúchas, protector of his kinsmen. The man clansman would follow into battle out of loyalty and obligation, stretching back generations. On the other, he's a feudal baron with a charter, a court, and a working set of gallows, answering not to his clansmen's consent, but to the crown that granted him the jurisdiction in the first place. Those two roles didn't always pull in the same direction. And the crown, watching this arrangement from Edinburgh, grew increasingly uneasy with exactly how much independent power it added up to. A chief who could raise an army and hang his own tenants, using two separate legal justifications for each. Which is why, in August of 1609, 9 Hebridean chiefs found themselves summoned to the island of Iona. James VI sent Bishop Andrew Knox to get them there, and to get their signatures on a document that came to be known as the Statutes of Iona. Popular retellings often say the chiefs were essentially kidnapped, tricked aboard a ship, and held until they agreed. The Privy Council's own record is less cinematic than that, though it's clear enough the meeting wasn't exactly voluntary in spirit, whatever the formalities looked like on paper. Historians are still a little divided on how much coercion actually happened versus how much got added in the retelling. Genuinely divided, not just textbook divided. If you've got a theory on which version is closer to the truth, the comments are open. What both versions agree on is the outcome. Chiefs including Ruairi Mór MacLeod of Dunvegan and Domhnall Gore MacDonald of Sleat put their names to a bond limiting the size of their private retinues, banning the wandering bards who'd traditionally glorified clan warfare in verse, and, this is the one that mattered most in the long run, requiring every chief's eldest son to be sent to school in the lowlands until he could speak, read, and write English. That's not an attack on Dúchas. Nobody at Iona touched the clan's kinship structure directly. It's an attack on the culture that made Dúchas function. The bards, the retinues, the Gaelic first upbringing of the next generation of chiefs. The feudal half of a chief's power, the charters and courts, stayed completely untouched by the Statutes of Iona. That would take another 137 years and a battlefield to finally come apart. Culloden fell on the 16th of April, 1746. Less than a year later, on Tower Hill, Simon Fraser would lose his head, and the legal machinery for finishing off the other half of a chief's power was already moving through Parliament while his trial was still underway. Before we get to that machinery, it's worth being precise about what it did and didn't touch. Parliament passed other laws that same year too, banning Highland dress, disarming the clans generally. That's a real story, but it's a different one, about culture and symbol. This one is narrower, and in some ways sharper, what happened to the courts. And it turns out the courts were a much bigger tangle than the Highlands alone. Private, hereditary jurisdiction wasn't some Highland peculiarity. It ran across the whole of Scotland. In 1745, the country had 33 sheriffdoms running its regional court system. Only 8 of those sheriffs were actually appointed by the king that year. The other 25 had become hereditary, passed down inside families exactly the way a chief's title was. Chiefs included among the 25, but very much not alone. That machinery had a name, the Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746, taking full effect the following March. Read what it actually does, and it's remarkably precise surgery. It doesn't touch clan membership. It doesn't touch a chief's right to be recognized as chief. What it removes, specifically, is the Baron Courts, the Regality Courts, the Pit and Gallows, the entire Old Reach side of the equation, the part built on crown charter rather than kinship. Sheriffdoms reverted to the crown. Baronial jurisdiction over life and limb simply ceased to exist. Here's the detail most retellings of this story leave out. The Act of Union of 1707 had explicitly classed heritable jurisdictions as private property. So when Parliament took them away in 1746, it had to pay for them. £152,000, split among the dispossessed landowners. The Duke of Argyll, himself chief of Clan Campbell, held not just an ordinary barony, but a regality, a rank above it, with criminal jurisdiction almost as broad as Scotland's own Supreme Criminal Court. He alone collected £25,000 of the payout. Simon Fraser got nothing. He'd been attainted for treason, his estates forfeited outright rather than compensated. The state's way of drawing a sharp line between chiefs who'd backed the losing side and chiefs who hadn't. Which tells you something the standard, the government crushed the clans version of this story tends to flatten out. This wasn't an ideological campaign against Highland culture as a whole. It was a state settling accounts with private property, at market rates, for the loyal, and confiscating the identical property outright from the disloyal. You don't compensate someone for a folk custom. You compensate them for an asset. Treating it that way, at exactly this scale, is about as clear a confirmation as you'll find that the jurisdictional half of chiefship had been genuinely, legally feudal all along. So go back to the open question from Tower Hill. Which of Lovat's two titles could Parliament actually kill? The peerage, yes, attainted, extinguished, gone the moment the executioner's axe came down. It would sit dormant for over a century before being restored, in 1854, to a descendant who'd already inherited leadership of the Fraser name through the ordinary course of the family line, regardless of what the crown had or hadn't recognized in the meantime. The chiefship never went anywhere for Parliament to erase in the first place. There was no statute empowering any court in London to decide who the Frasers regarded as their chief. That recognition ran on Dúchas, on the clan's own consent, and no Act of Parliament had ever claimed jurisdiction over that in the way it plainly did over Pit and Gallows. Which is exactly why, nearly 300 years later, this question isn't purely historical. The court of the Lord Lion, the oldest heraldic court in the world still sitting daily, in Edinburgh, right now, is the direct legal descendant of the same apparatus that once granted baronies and jurisdictions. It no longer hands out gallows, it hands out recognition. Who counts in Scots law as a clan's legitimate chief? As recently as 2019, Clan Carruthers went 2 centuries without a chief, before the Lord Lion formally confirmed one, converting the clan into what Scots law calls a noble incorporation. The feudal machinery didn't vanish in 1747. It narrowed down to exactly the one thing that survived Culloden intact, and it's still running. That's the kind of detail that's fun to bring up at dinner and watch someone's face change. The clan system didn't die out in the 1800s. Legally, a sliver of it is still open for business in an Edinburgh courtroom today. So, 3 things worth carrying out of this one. First, the plain factual answer. Clan chiefs weren't feudal nobility instead of kin-based patriarchs, and they weren't kin-based patriarchs wearing a feudal costume. For most of the early modern period, a substantial chief ran both systems at once, side by side, under separate legal justification. Dúchas answering to the clan, Richard answering to the crown. Second, the reframe, the untouched ancient Highland clan, most people picture, doesn't hold up as a clean category at all. Fraser and Chisholm, 2 names that sound about as authentically Highland as it gets, start their Scottish story as Norman feudal grants. The kinship came after, sometimes centuries after. Third, and this is the one that actually changes how you should think about 1747. This is not a story about a culture getting erased. This is not a story about a government stamping out a way of life in one clean stroke. This is not even really a story about the Highlands losing. It's a story about a state discovering, with remarkable legal precision, exactly which half of a very old institution it had the power to buy out, and exactly which half it never had jurisdiction over to begin with. That second half is still running, right now, in Edinburgh, under a Lord Lion who can still confirm or deny a chief. Here's my question for the comments. If you'd been born a tenant on a chief's land in 1740, bound by kinship on one side and by pit and gallows jurisdiction on the other, which one do you think would have felt more real to you day to day? The family obligation or the court? I genuinely don't think the answer's obvious. Tell me what you land on. Lord Lovat died laughing at a collapsed grandstand, holding a title Parliament could erase and one it couldn't. Nearly 300 years later, that second title is still the one doing the work.